They say fear is the universe's most honest emotion. I've witnessed civilizations that could bend reality to their will, species that communicated through quantum entanglement, and empires that spanned entire galactic clusters. Yet none of them inspired the kind of primal terror that rippled through the cosmos whenever someone whispered a single word. Human. I used to think it was just propaganda. Surely these bipedal primates from a backwater planet couldn't be as dangerous as the story suggested. After all, they had no natural armor, no telepathic abilities, no energy manipulation powers. They couldn't even see properly in the dark. But then I saw them charge. Not retreat. Not calculate odds. Not negotiate. Charge into certain death with nothing but primitive weapons and something they called honor. That's when I understood why every intelligent species in the galaxy had the same nightmare. The sound of human war cries echoing through the void. This is my testimony. This is why I can never sleep peacefully again. This is the truth about why the universe fears them. My name is Zeth Kree, and I am a military analyst for the Galactic Confederation's Intelligence Division. For 3 decades, I have studied warfare across 17 different species, documented battle strategies that have shaped the fate of star systems, and earned the respect of generals whose names are whispered in reverence throughout the known galaxy. I believed I understood conflict in all its forms. I was wrong. The assignment seemed routine when it arrived through encrypted channels at my station on Kepler 442b. The Confederation had been monitoring a new species that had recently achieved faster-than-light travel. These humans from a planet called Earth had made contact with our outer colonies, and initial reports suggested they were technologically inferior, but showed unusual tactical adaptability. My job was simple: observe their military capabilities and provide a threat assessment. The humans had been granted permission to establish a small outpost on Zirian Prime, a frontier world that served as a buffer zone between Confederation space and the territory of the Vraktar Empire. The Vraktar were an ancient warrior race, standing nearly 3 meters tall, with chitinous exoskeletons and natural weapons that could pierce most known armor. They had been testing our boundaries for months, conducting raids on isolated settlements, and withdrawing before our response fleets could arrive. When I arrived at Zirian Prime aboard the research vessel Astral Observer, I was struck by how ordinary the human settlement appeared. Their structures were functional, but unremarkable, built from standard prefabricated materials that any developing civilization might use. The humans themselves were even more underwhelming. They stood barely 2 meters tall at most, with soft skin that seemed vulnerable to the slightest injury. Their eyes could only perceive a narrow spectrum of light, and their hearing was adequate at best. The human commander, a weathered individual named Colonel Sarah Chun, greeted me with what I later learned was called a handshake. Her grip was firm, but not crushing. Her demeanor professional, but not intimidating. She had graying hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of age and experience, but there was something else there too, something I couldn't quite identify at the time. "Welcome to Zirian Prime, analyst Zeth Kree," she said in perfectly accented galactic standard. "I understand you're here to observe our operations. I hope you find what you're looking for." I assured her that my presence would not interfere with their normal routines, and she assigned Lieutenant Marcus Webb to serve as my liaison. Webb was younger than Shun, with the kind of easy smile that many species use to disarm potential threats. He showed me to quarters that had been prepared specifically for my physiology and gave me a tour of the settlement. The human military installation was surprisingly well organized. Their equipment was primitive by Confederation standards: kinetic weapons that fired metal projectiles, vehicles that relied on chemical combustion, and communication systems that would have been obsolete in most civilized sectors for centuries. Yet there was something about the way the humans maintained their gear that caught my attention. Every weapon was clean and functional. Every piece of equipment had been carefully maintained. There was no waste, no carelessness. "How many personnel do you have stationed here?" I asked Webb as we walked through their armory. 237 combat personnel, plus support staff," he replied, checking the charge on what appeared to be some kind of energy weapon. "Not much by galactic standards, but we make do." I made notes on my portable recorder. The human force was indeed small, smaller than a typical Confederation security detachment for a world of this size. Yet their confidence seemed unshaken by their obvious numerical disadvantages. Over the following days, I observed their training routines. The humans practiced combat scenarios with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. They drilled in formations, practiced marksmanship, and engaged in hand-to-hand combat exercises that seemed designed to prepare them for the worst possible circumstances. What struck me most was their emphasis on scenarios where everything went wrong, where their equipment failed, where they were outnumbered, where victory seemed impossible. "Why do you train for defeat?" I asked Webb during one particularly brutal exercise where human soldiers practiced fighting with damaged weapons and limited ammunition. Webb paused in cleaning his rifle and looked at me with those strange human eyes. "We don't train for defeat, sir. We train for when everything else fails." There's a difference. I didn't understand the distinction at the time. The humans also displayed peculiar social behaviors. They told stories, not historical accounts or technical briefings, but narratives that seemed to serve no practical purpose. They spoke of heroes from their past, individuals who had faced impossible odds, and either triumphed through determination or died in the attempt. These stories were told with reverence, as if the mere act of remembering them provided some kind of strength. One evening, I listened as Colonel Chun addressed her troops before a routine patrol. She spoke of their duty not just to the Confederation, but to each other and to the principles they represented. She mentioned concepts like honor, sacrifice, and the importance of standing firm when everything seemed lost. The soldiers listened with an attention that went beyond mere military discipline. They believed every word. "Sir," Webb approached me after the briefing. "The colonel asked if you'd like to join the patrol tomorrow. Nothing dangerous, just a routine sweep of the eastern perimeter. Might give you a better sense of how we operate in the field." I accepted the invitation, though I expected little more than a mundane trek through Zirian Prime's rocky terrain. The patrol consisted of 12 humans equipped with their standard gear, moving in a formation that seemed designed for maximum tactical flexibility. They communicated through hand signals and brief radio transmissions, maintaining constant awareness of their surroundings. It was during this patrol that I first encountered the Vraktar. The attack came without warning. One moment, we were traversing a narrow canyon between two ridges of volcanic rock, and the next we were surrounded by the distinctive chittering war cries of Vraktar raiders. I counted at least 30 of them positioned on the canyon walls above us, their naturally armored forms moving with predatory grace as they prepared to descend on our small group. The tactical situation was hopeless. The humans were outnumbered more than 2-1 by opponents who possessed superior physical attributes and defensive capabilities. The canyon offered no cover and no viable escape routes. Any sensible military force would have immediately attempted to negotiate or surrender, hoping to preserve their lives for a prisoner exchange. The humans did neither. Instead, Colonel Chin's voice crackled over their communication system with words that would echo in my memory for the rest of my life. "Contact front. Vraktar raiders, estimated 30+ hostiles. All units, we stand and fight." I waited for the tactical analysis, the discussion of retreat options, the careful weighing of odds that any rational military force would undertake. Instead, I heard something that chilled my very core, the sound of human laughter. "About time," muttered Sergeant Rodriguez as he checked his weapon. I was getting bored. The Vraktar began their descent, moving with the confidence of predators who had cornered their prey. Their war cries echoed off the canyon walls, a sound designed to inspire terror in their enemies. I had heard recordings of these vocalizations during my studies. They were known to cause paralysis in many species through a combination of infrasonic frequencies and psychological pressure. The humans responded with war cries of their own. The sound was unlike anything in my extensive database of military communications. It wasn't a tactical signal or a coordination tool. It was something primal, something that seemed to rise from the deepest parts of human nature. As the Vraktar descended, the humans raised their weapons and charged forward to meet them. Not backward toward potential escape routes. Not into defensive positions where they might have better odds. Forward, into certain death. Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to make contact with the descending raiders. A massive Vraktar warrior, easily twice his size and covered in natural armor that could deflect most small arms fire, landed directly in front of him with claws extended. Any rational being would have retreated or attempted to avoid close combat with such an opponent. Rodriguez smiled and attacked with his bare hands. I watched in horrified fascination as the human grappled with the Vraktar warrior, using techniques that seemed to ignore the fundamental laws of combat physics. He wrapped his arms around the creature's primary weapon limb and used his own body weight to redirect its momentum, sending both of them tumbling across the rocky ground. One of Raktar's secondary claws raked across his chest, tearing through his armor and drawing blood. Rodriguez only laughed and struck back with increased intensity. Around me, similar scenes were unfolding as human soldiers engaged Raktar raiders in close combat that should have been suicide. Private Chun, no relation to the colonel, actually grabbed a Raktar by its primary sensory organs and used them as leverage to snap the creature's neck. Lieutenant Morrison took a claw through his shoulder and responded by detonating an explosive device at point-blank range, killing both himself and 2 raiders. But it was what Colonel Chun did that truly demonstrated why the universe fears humans. A Raktar pack leader, distinguished by the crimson markings on its exoskeleton that indicated veteran status, had positioned itself at the head of the canyon to direct the attack. This was clearly the tactical commander of the raiding party, and eliminating it would disrupt their coordination. Unfortunately, it was also the largest and most dangerous opponent on the battlefield, armed with natural weapons that had earned of Raktar their reputation as one of the galaxy's most feared warrior races. Chun looked at the pack leader, then at her troops, then back at the pack leader. She keyed her radio one final time. "For Earth," she said simply. Then she sprinted directly at the pack leader, covering the distance between them in seconds and launching herself through the air in what could only be described as a flying tackle. The Raktar, caught completely off guard by this suicidal attack, had barely enough time to bring its weapons to bear before Chun slammed into its center mass and drove both of them to the ground. What happened next defied everything I thought I knew about combat dynamics. The pack leader was larger, stronger, better armed, and protected by natural armor that should have made Chin's attacks ineffective. But Chun had something the Raktar didn't understand, something that no species in the galaxy had ever properly documented. She had absolute, uncompromising determination to continue fighting regardless of injury, pain, or the mathematical certainty of death. When the Raktar's claws opened wounds across her arms and torso, she used her own blood to blind it temporarily. When its secondary limbs pinned her legs, she used her teeth to attack its sensory organs. When its primary weapons pierced her abdomen, she grabbed them and held on, preventing the creature from withdrawing them to attack again. The pack leader, faced with an opponent who refused to acknowledge that she was dying, began to make sounds I had never heard from a Raktar before. Fear, confusion, something approaching panic. She never stopped fighting, even as her life signs weakened. Even as rational analysis indicated she should have been incapacitated by her injuries, she continued to press her attack with undiminished intensity. The Raktar, bred for combat and trained from birth to dominate through superior force, had no response to an enemy who simply would not quit. In the end, Chun killed the pack leader with a combat knife she drew from her boot. The blade was primitive by galactic standards, little more than sharpened metal, but she drove it into the creature's primary neural cluster with the last of her strength. Both combatants died within seconds of each other, but the psychological impact on the remaining Raktar was immediate and devastating. They retreated. A force of veteran Raktar raiders, who had been winning the engagement decisively just moments before, abandoned the battle and fled. They left behind their wounded and their dead, driven away by the sheer impossibility of what they had witnessed. As I knelt beside Colonel Chin's body, trying to understand what I had just observed, Lieutenant Webb approached with his own injuries still bleeding freely. "Sir," he said quietly, "you're going to want to call for medical evacuation for the wounded." And he paused, looking down at his fallen commander. "And someone should probably tell command that Colonel Chun kept her promise." "What promise?" I asked. Webb smiled that same easy smile I'd seen when we first met, though now it was colored by grief and exhaustion. "She told us when we first got here that if the Raktar wanted this planet, they'd have to go through us to get it." Turns out she meant it literally. As I watched the surviving humans tend to their wounded and prepare their dead for transport, I began to understand why every intelligence report I had ever read contained the same warning about this species. They do not retreat, they do not surrender, and they do not know when they are beaten. That night, as I compiled my initial observations for transmission back to Confederation headquarters, I realized that I was no longer studying a military force. I was documenting something far more dangerous, a species that had weaponized its own willingness to die. The universe fears humans not because they're the strongest or the fastest or the most intelligent. The universe fears humans because they're the only species that looks at impossible odds and charges forward anyway. And after what I witnessed in that canyon, I was beginning to understand why. The medical evacuation transport arrived 6 hours after the canyon engagement, its Confederation medical team immediately taking charge of the wounded humans. I observed their procedures with growing confusion as the medics expressed amazement at the survival rates among the injured. This one took a claw through the lung and kept fighting for another 20 minutes, reported Dr. Vixtal, the team's chief physician, as she examined Sergeant Rodriguez. By all medical logic, he should have been unconscious within minutes. Rodriguez, despite his extensive injuries, attempted to sit up on the examination table. "Doc, I've got work to do." Your squad is being taken care of," interrupted Lieutenant Webb, who had refused treatment until all his men had been seen. "That's an order, Sergeant." I watched this exchange with fascination. Among most species, severe injury triggered immediate submission to medical authority and a focus on self-preservation. The humans seemed to consider their injuries secondary to their continued operational effectiveness. Even more puzzling was their obvious distress at being temporarily separated from their unit for treatment. Dr. Vixtal pulled me aside as her team worked. "Analyst Zeth Cree, I've treated wounded soldiers from dozens of species, but I've never seen anything like this. Their pain tolerance is remarkable, but that's not what's unusual. They seem genuinely more concerned about their comrades than their own injuries." She gestured toward Private Chun, who was arguing with a medic about returning to duty despite a severely fractured arm. "Look at their stress responses. Most species show elevated anxiety when injured because they're vulnerable and separated from their group. These humans show elevated anxiety because they're not with their group to provide protection." This observation aligned with behavioral patterns I had noticed during my time at the settlement. The humans operated as interconnected units rather than collections of individuals. Their loyalty to each other seemed to supersede basic survival instincts. That evening, I attended the memorial service for Colonel Chun and the 3 other humans who had died in the canyon. I expected a formal military ceremony focused on honoring their sacrifice for the greater mission. Instead, I witnessed something that challenged my understanding of how military organizations function. The surviving members of Chen's unit took turns sharing stories about their fallen comrades. Not their professional achievements or tactical contributions, but personal memories that revealed their individual personalities. They spoke of Chen's terrible sense of humor, her habit of collecting alien music from every world she visited, and the way she remembered the names of everyone's family members back on Earth. "She used to say that courage wasn't about not being afraid," said Lieutenant Webb, his voice steady despite obvious grief. "She said courage was about doing what needed to be done when you were scared out of your mind." As the ceremony continued, I noticed that the humans weren't just mourning their losses. They were using the shared grief to strengthen their remaining bonds. Each story reinforced their commitment to each other and to the principles Chun had represented. Rather than weakening the unit, the deaths had somehow made them more cohesive. Following the memorial, I requested permission to review Chen's personal files and command decisions. What I found contradicted standard military theory about leadership and unit effectiveness. Chen had consistently chosen tactics that prioritized the welfare of her soldiers and civilian populations over strategic objectives. In one incident report, she had abandoned a planned attack on Vraktar supply lines because it would have required leaving wounded personnel behind. Yet her unit's performance ratings were exceptional. Her soldiers showed loyalty levels that exceeded anything in my database, and their combat effectiveness in desperate situations was unprecedented. Chun had somehow created a military force that fought harder the worse their situation became. 3 days after the canyon engagement, I received new orders from Confederation intelligence. The Vraktar Empire had responded to their raiders' defeat by dispatching a full battle group to Zirium Prime. Long-range sensors detected 12 heavy cruisers and an assault carrier containing thousands of veteran troops. The human settlement would be facing overwhelming force within 48 hours. I expected the Confederation to immediately evacuate the human outpost. The tactical situation was hopeless. 200 humans could not possibly withstand an assault by a Vraktar battle group. Any rational military analysis would recommend immediate withdrawal to preserve personnel and equipment for future operations. Instead, the humans requested reinforcements. Negative on the evacuation, command transmitted the new ranking officer, Major Harrison, who had assumed Chen's responsibilities. We're here to hold this position, and that's exactly what we intend to do. The response from Confederation Command was swift and decisive. No reinforcements were available, and the strategic value of Zirian Prime did not justify the losses that would result from a major engagement with the Vraktar. The humans were ordered to conduct a fighting withdrawal and evacuate to the nearest Confederation stronghold. Major Harrison acknowledged the order, then promptly ignored it. "Sir," I said to him after listening to the transmission, "you understand that disobeying a direct order from Confederation Command could result in court-martial proceedings?" Harrison looked at me with the same expression I had seen on Chen's face, that unidentifiable something that seemed to be a fundamental part of human nature. "Analyst Zethkri, let me ask you something. If the Vraktar take this world, what happens to the civilian settlements in this sector?" I consulted my tactical database. The Vraktar typically use captured territory as staging areas for further expansion. They would likely establish military outposts and use the local population for forced labor. And if we withdraw our forces, the sector would become untenable for Confederation members. We would be forced to pull back our defensive lines by approximately 30 light years. Harrison nodded. "So by following orders and retreating, we save 200 human soldiers and condemn approximately 50,000 civilians to enslavement or worse. That is a simplified but accurate assessment. Then we're not retreating." Harrison turned to address his assembled officers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have 48 hours to prepare for the fight of our lives. The Vraktar are bringing everything they've got, and Command has made it clear we're on our own." I waited for the predictable response: protests about impossible odds, demands for clarification from higher command, or at least requests for additional equipment and support. Instead, I heard something that sent chills through my entire nervous system. Laughter. Genuine, enthusiastic human laughter. "About damn time," said Captain Williams, the commander of the Human Air Support Squadron. "I was wondering when they'd get serious about this." Over the next 2 days, I observed preparations that defied every principle of rational military planning. The humans began converting their settlement into what could only be described as a fortress designed specifically to maximize enemy casualties rather than preserve friendly forces. They constructed killing zones, prepared explosives that would deny key terrain even if it destroyed their own positions, and stockpiled ammunition for a siege they had no mathematical possibility of surviving. More disturbing was their attitude toward the approaching battle. Rather than the grim determination I would have expected from soldiers facing certain death, the humans displayed something approaching eagerness. They joked with each other as they prepared defensive positions, shared stories about famous last stand from their military history, and composed messages to their families back on Earth that spoke of honor rather than regret. "Sir," said Sergeant Martinez as he supervised the placement of anti-vehicle mines, "you might want to consider evacuating with the next supply transport. Things are going to get pretty intense around here." I have been considering exactly that option. My mission was to observe and report, not to participate in suicidal military operations. It's something about the humans' preparation compelled me to remain. I needed to understand what I was witnessing. On the morning the Vraktar battle group entered the system, I stood in the command center watching long-range sensors track their approach. 12 massive warships, each one capable of reducing the human settlement to rubble within minutes, moved toward Zirian Prime with the inexorable certainty of a natural disaster. Major Harrison studied the tactical display with the calm attention of someone reviewing routine operational data. Estimated time to orbital bombardment range: 4 hours, 17 minutes, reported the communications officer. And time of troop deployment range: 6 hours, 38 minutes. Harrison nodded and activated the settlement's general communication system. His voice reached every human on Zirian Prime, from the soldiers preparing their weapons to the support staff who had volunteered to remain despite the evacuation order. "People of Zirian Prime," he began, "in approximately 6 hours, we're going to face the largest Vraktar assault force ever assembled against a single target. They outnumber us by at least 20 to 1. They have orbital fire support, and they've brought enough troops to overwhelm our defenses through sheer mass." He paused, and I could see him smiling despite the devastating tactical situation. "They have no idea what they're walking into." The response from across the settlement was immediate and overwhelming. The sound of human voices raised in what I later learned was called a battle cry. It was a sound that seemed to combine defiance, determination, and something approaching joy. Listening to it, I felt a primal fear response that I couldn't fully explain. The Vraktar think this is going to be an easy victory, Harrison continued. They think we'll break when they bring their full force to bear. They think we'll surrender when we realize we're outnumbered. They think we're just another species that value survival over principle. Another pause, longer this time. Let's show them how wrong they are. As the hours passed, I witnessed something unprecedented in my decades of military analysis. The humans didn't just prepare for battle, they prepared for a specific type of battle. Every defensive position was designed not to hold out as long as possible, but to inflict maximum casualties while falling. Every weapon was positioned not for optimal defensive coverage, but for maximum damage to attacking forces. Every tactical plan assumed that the position would eventually be overrun and focused on making that victory as costly as possible for the enemy. They were preparing to lose in a way that would terrify anyone who survived the experience. 2 hours before the assault began, I made my final transmission to Confederation intelligence. My report contained tactical assessments, casualty projections, and behavioral observations that would reshape our understanding of human military psychology. But it was my personal addendum that I considered most important. To any military commander who may face human forces in the future, do not assume their surrender when victory becomes impossible. Do not assume their retreat when positions become untenable. Do not assume their cooperation when captured. The humans possess a psychological framework that treats death as an acceptable outcome if it serves their larger objectives. This makes them unpredictable in ways that standard tactical doctrine cannot address. As I sealed the transmission, Major Harrison approached my position in the command bunker. Analyst Zeth Cree, he said formally, I want to thank you for your service during this operation. Your observations and analysis have been invaluable. I realized he was speaking as if our mission was already complete, rather than facing its most critical phase. Major, the engagement hasn't begun yet. No, sir, it hasn't. But, win or lose, this is going to be the last transmission going off-world for a while. When a Vraktar review what happened here, I want them to understand exactly what they encountered. He handed me a sealed data packet. These are the personal messages from my people to their families. If you make it out of this, please see that they're delivered. The weight of the data packet seemed to represent far more than its physical mass. Each message represented a human who had chosen to remain and fight despite knowing they would not survive the experience. They had written final letters to their loved ones not in despair, but as part of their preparation for battle. As the Vraktar assault carrier moved into troop deployment range, I finally understood what I had been observing during my time with the humans. They had not come to Zirian Prime to establish a colony or conduct routine military operations. They had come to send a message that would echo across the galaxy for generations. Humanity does not yield. The Vraktar orbital bombardment began at 1427 local time with surgical precision that demonstrated their tactical superiority. Rather than reducing the entire settlement to rubble, they targeted specific military installations with energy weapons that could have eliminated the human presence in minutes if applied indiscriminately. This restraint puzzled me until I realized they intended to capture the settlement largely intact for their own use. It was their first mistake. The humans had anticipated this approach and prepared accordingly. As the first energy bolts struck what appeared to be critical defensive positions, secondary explosions erupted throughout the settlement. The humans had booby-trapped their own installations to deny them to enemy forces, but, more importantly, they had created the appearance of suffering massive damage while leaving their actual defensive capabilities intact. Confirmed successful detonation of decoy installations, reported Lieutenant Weber from the primary command bunker, which had been constructed 30 meters underground and shielded against orbital bombardment. Enemy targeting systems should read us as 70% neutralized. Major Harrison smiled grimly as he studied the tactical displays. The Vraktar were conducting exactly the kind of methodical assault that human doctrine anticipated. Phase 1 complete. Estimate time to troop deployment. 12 minutes until the first wave lands, sir. I watched the humans make final preparations with growing fascination. Rather than the desperate activity I expected from defenders facing overwhelming odds, Their movements showed the calm efficiency of professionals executing a well-rehearsed plan. Each soldier checked their weapons, confirmed their assigned positions, and received final instructions with the same attention to detail they might show during routine training exercises. "Sir," said Sergeant Rodriguez, his wound from the canyon engagement still visible beneath his armor, "the boys are asking if we're going with the Thermopylae Protocol or the Alamos Special." Harrison considered for a moment. "Thermopylae Protocol. We want them to remember this as long as possible." I had no context for these references, but the effect on human morale was immediate and obvious. Soldiers who had been quietly focused suddenly began displaying the same anticipatory energy I had observed during their war cries. They were drawing strength from some shared cultural memory that transformed their desperate situation into something approaching celebration. The first Vractar dropships entered the atmosphere like falling meteors, their heat shields glowing as they descended toward predetermined landing zones outside the settlement's defensive perimeter. Long-range sensors detected troop carriers designed to deploy entire companies of Vractar warriors simultaneously, followed by heavy support vehicles equipped with weapons capable of breaching fortified positions. "Contact," announced the communications officer as the dropships touched down. Multiple landings confirmed. Enemy force strength estimated at 1,500 initial deployment, with follow-up waves inbound. 1,500 Vractar warriors against 200 humans. The mathematical impossibility of the situation should have triggered immediate surrender negotiations or desperate evacuation attempts. Instead, Major Harrison opened the general communication channel and spoke with the calm authority of someone announcing routine operational updates. "All units, this is command. The Vractar have arrived in force and are beginning deployment operations. You know the plan, you know your positions, and you know what's at stake. Remember that we're not just fighting for ourselves, we're fighting for everyone who comes after us." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Make them remember this day." The human response was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of voices raised in a war cry that seemed to shake the very foundations of the underground command center. It was a sound that conveyed no fear, no desperation, no acceptance of defeat. Instead, it communicated something far more dangerous: absolute commitment to making their enemies pay for every meter of ground. The Vractar ground assault began with textbook precision. Advanced scouts moved toward the settlement using terrain features for cover, while heavy weapons teams established overwatch positions. Their coordination was flawless, their equipment superior, and their numerical advantage overwhelming. Any conventional analysis would have predicted the rapid collapse of human resistance, followed by the systematic elimination of remaining defenders. The first indication that this would not be a conventional battle came when the Vractar advanced scouts triggered the outer defensive perimeter. The humans had spent their preparation time creating what appeared to be standard minefields and defensive obstacles, but their actual purpose was far more psychological than tactical. The initial explosions were designed not to inflict maximum casualties, but to funnel the advancing Vractar into specific approach routes where human weapons could achieve optimal effectiveness. More importantly, the mines were equipped with audio devices that broadcast human war cries at volumes designed to disorient and intimidate the attackers. "What are they doing?" I asked Major Harrison as we monitored the enemy advance through perimeter sensors. "Psychological warfare," he replied, watching as Vractar units hesitated in response to the broadcast war cries. The Vractar are used to opponents who fight defensively when outnumbered. They're not used to enemies who sound excited about the opportunity to engage them in close combat. As the Vractar formations approached the settlement's inner defensive perimeter, the humans implemented the next phase of their plan. Rather than waiting for the enemy to reach their prepared positions, human squads emerged from concealed bunkers behind the advancing Vractar and launched immediate close-range attacks. This reversal of conventional defensive doctrine created chaos in the Vractar ranks. Forces that had been advancing confidently suddenly found themselves engaged from multiple directions by enemies who seemed to materialize from the ground itself. Even more confusing was the humans' apparent disregard for their own safety as they pressed attacks against numerically superior opponents. I watched through sensor feeds as Sergeant Martinez led his squad in a flanking maneuver that brought them into direct contact with a Vractar heavy weapons position. The enemy had established their position on elevated ground with excellent fields of fire, protected by natural armor, and equipped with weapons that could neutralize human infantry at extreme range. Martinez studied the position for approximately 30 seconds, then turned to his squad with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. "All right, people, here's the plan. We're going to charge straight up that hill and take out that weapons team before they can relocate." Private Johnson raised his hand. "Sergeant, that's a suicide mission. They've got overlapping fields of fire and elevation advantage." Martinez grinned. "That's what makes it interesting." What followed defied everything I understood about tactical decision-making. The human squad left their concealed positions and launched a direct frontal assault on a superior enemy force in an advantageous defensive position. They should have been eliminated within seconds of beginning their attack. Instead, they succeeded. The Vraktar weapons team, faced with enemies who were charging directly towards certain death while screaming war cries, suffered what appeared to be a collective failure of nerve. Their return fire was inaccurate and poorly coordinated, as if they couldn't quite process what they were witnessing. By the time they recovered their composure, Martinez and his squad had closed to hand-to-hand range where human determination proved superior to Vraktar equipment advantages. Similar scenes were unfolding throughout the battle zone as human squads abandoned defensive positions to launch attacks that violated every principle of military science. They charged machine gun nests, assaulted armored vehicles with nothing but explosives and determination, and engaged in hand-to-hand combat with opponents twice their size and naturally armed with deadly weapons. The effect on Vraktar morale was immediate and devastating. Warriors who had never experienced defeat began displaying signs of confusion and uncertainty. Their tactical coordination, which had been flawless during the initial assault, began to deteriorate as unit commanders struggled to respond to enemies who seemed to welcome combat regardless of the odds. "Sir," reported the communications officer, "we're receiving panic transmissions from Vraktar ground forces. They're requesting immediate orbital fire support on their own positions." I stared at the tactical display in disbelief. "They're calling for bombardment of positions they currently occupy?" Major Harrison nodded grimly. "That's what happens when you encounter an enemy that scares you more than your own weapons do." The Vraktar orbital commander initially refused the fire support request, unable to comprehend why ground forces would prefer bombardment to continued engagement with human infantry. This hesitation gave the humans precious minutes to press their advantage and inflict additional casualties on increasingly demoralized enemy forces. It was during this phase of the battle that I witnessed the event that would haunt my dreams for years to come. Captain Williams, the human air support commander, had been coordinating defensive operations from a forward command post when it came under direct assault by a Vraktar shock troop company. The position was overrun within minutes, and Williams found herself alone against 12 veteran Vraktar warriors. Any rational being would have attempted to escape or surrender. Williams did neither. Instead, she activated her personal communication device and broadcast on all frequencies. "This is Captain Williams to any human forces in range. I'm about to demonstrate why our enemies have nightmares about us." What followed was broadcast throughout the entire battle zone, received not only by human forces but intercepted by Vraktar communication systems. Williams, armed only with a sidearm and a combat knife, launched herself at 12 opponents who possessed every conceivable advantage. The engagement lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. When it ended, Williams was dead, but so were 7 of the Vraktar warriors. The 5 survivors were found in a state of shock, unable to explain how a single human had inflicted such devastating casualties while facing impossible odds. The psychological impact of this transmission on both human and Vraktar forces was immediate and profound. Human units across the battlefield began launching increasingly aggressive attacks, inspired by Williams' example. Simultaneously, Vraktar forces began showing signs of panic and confusion as they struggled to comprehend an enemy that seemed to grow more dangerous when facing defeat. "Command to all units," transmitted Major Harrison as reports flooded in from across the battle zone. "Captain Williams has shown us the way. Let's make sure her sacrifice counts." The response from human forces was unlike anything in my extensive database of military communications. Rather than acknowledging orders or reporting status, the radio frequencies filled with something approaching singing. Human voices raised in harmonies that seemed to transform the battlefield itself. The Vraktar forces, listening to these transmissions through their intercepted communications, began displaying behavior that had never been documented in their species. Veteran warriors who had participated in hundreds of successful campaigns started abandoning their positions and retreating toward their landing zones without orders. "Sir," reported a panicked Vraktar field commander to his orbital support, "the humans are singing while they die. They're singing, and they won't stop fighting. Request immediate evacuation of all ground forces." I listened to these intercepted communications with growing amazement. The most feared warrior race in the known galaxy was being psychologically defeated by an enemy they outnumbered 7-1. The humans weren't winning the tactical engagement. They were winning something far more important. They were winning the psychological war. As the battle entered its 6th hour, the Vraktar began implementing desperate measures to end the engagement. Orbital bombardment was authorized on positions containing their own forces, and emergency reinforcements were deployed from the assault carrier despite the tactical doctrine that recommended against committing reserves to operations that weren't proceeding according to plan. But each new Vraktar unit that entered the battle zone encountered the same impossible phenomenon. Human soldiers who fought harder the worse their situation became. Warriors who had been mortally wounded continued attacking until their bodies could no longer function. Squads that were surrounded and outnumbered responded by launching counterattacks rather than attempting to break out. Most terrifying of all, the humans seemed to be enjoying themselves. "Sir," said Lieutenant Weber as he monitored communications from human units across the battlefield, "Sergeant Rodriguez is requesting permission to conduct what he calls aggressive reconnaissance toward the main Vraktar landing zone." Harrison raised an eyebrow. "That's 15 kilometers behind enemy lines, defended by at least a battalion of their best troops." "Yes, sir." Rodriguez says it sounds like a target-rich environment. Harrison actually laughed. "Permission granted. Tell him to make it memorable." As I listened to this exchange, I realized that I was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic military history. The humans weren't just fighting a desperate defensive action. They were conducting offensive operations while outnumbered and surrounded. They had somehow transformed a hopeless tactical situation into an opportunity to inflict maximum psychological damage on their enemies. The universe fears humans not because they cannot be defeated, but because defeating them requires experiencing something no other species wants to endure. To defeat humans, you must watch them charge towards certain death while singing songs of defiance. You must witness them laugh in the face of impossible odds. You must endure their refusal to acknowledge when they have been beaten. Most terrifying of all, you must live with the knowledge that they will do it again and again and again until someone decides the cost of fighting them exceeds any possible benefit. As night fell over Zirian Prime, the Vraktar faced a decision that would reshape galactic politics for generations to come. They could continue the assault and eventually overwhelm the human defenders through sheer numbers and firepower. Victory was still mathematically inevitable, but victory would require explaining to their own people why thousands of their finest warriors had been terrorized by 200 humans who refused to stop fighting. That night, for the first time in their recorded history, the Vraktar Empire made a decision that prioritized psychological preservation over military conquest. They chose to retreat. The Vraktar withdrawal began at 23:47 local time, with emergency evacuation orders transmitted to all ground forces. I monitored their communications through the command center's intelligence systems, listening to something that had never been documented in their military history: panic among their officer corps. "All units, immediate fallback to extraction zones," transmitted the Vraktar ground commander, his voice carrying undertones of desperation that violated every protocol of their warrior culture. "Priority evacuation of all personnel. Authorization granted for abandonment of heavy equipment." Major Harrison studied the sensor readings showing Vraktar forces streaming back toward their landing zones in complete disarray. "They're actually running," he said with a mixture of amazement and satisfaction. "The most feared military force in the galaxy is retreating from 200 humans." What made the withdrawal even more remarkable was its nature. This wasn't a tactical repositioning or a strategic redeployment. It was a rout. Vraktar warriors abandoned equipment that had cost their empire decades to develop and manufacture. Officers left subordinates behind rather than risk additional casualties during rescue operations. Most telling of all, their orbital fleet began charging weapons systems not to provide covering fire for the withdrawal, but to threaten bombardment of the planet's surface if human forces attempted to pursue. Sir, reported Lieutenant Weber, monitoring human casualties throughout the battle zone. Final count shows 47 killed in action, 112 wounded. Enemy casualties estimated at over 3,000. The numbers defy belief. A force of 200 humans had not only survived an assault by overwhelming enemy numbers, but had inflicted casualty ratios that exceeded anything in recorded military history. More importantly, they had achieved something that no other species had ever accomplished. They had made the Vraktar Empire afraid. As I watched the enemy evacuation proceed through the night, I began receiving priority transmissions from Confederation intelligence demanding immediate status reports. The galactic political implications of what had occurred on Zirion Prime were staggering. If a small human force could psychologically defeat a major Vraktar assault, it would fundamentally alter the balance of power throughout the known galaxy. Analyst Zeth Kree, said Major Harrison as he prepared his own after-action reports, I want you to understand something about what happened here. This wasn't about superior tactics or advanced technology. This was about something that can't be taught or manufactured. What do you mean? Harrison gestured toward the tactical displays showing the departing Vraktar fleet. The Vraktar have spent centuries building their reputation through superior force and intimidation. They've conquered dozens of worlds because their enemies surrender rather than face the certain destruction that resistance would bring. But they've never encountered an enemy that considers destruction an acceptable price for victory. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I fully understood the distinction he was making. You're saying that human psychology gives you a tactical advantage? More than that, we don't just have a tactical advantage. We have a strategic advantage that no other species possesses. We can afford to lose battles that our enemies can't afford to win. This concept challenged everything I thought I understood about military strategy. How can losing provide a strategic advantage? Harrison smiled and activated his communication system to address the surviving members of his command. All units, this is Major Harrison. The Vraktar are withdrawing from Zirion Prime. Mission accomplished. The response from across the settlement was immediate and overwhelming. The sound of human voices raised in celebration that seemed to ignore the devastating casualties they had suffered. They were celebrating not just survival, but the knowledge that their sacrifice had achieved something unprecedented. That's how, Harrison said quietly as we listened to the celebration. We're celebrating because we proved something that the entire galaxy needed to know. Humans can't be defeated through intimidation, can't be conquered through superior force, and can't be controlled through fear. Over the following days, as Confederation medical teams arrived to treat the wounded and recovery teams began assessing the battle damage, I continued my analysis of what had transpired. The humans had lost nearly 25% of their force, suffered massive destruction to their settlement, and faced certain annihilation if the Vraktar had chosen to continue their assault. By any objective measure, they should have been defeated. Yet the political aftermath demonstrated the true scope of their victory. Within 72 hours of the Vraktar withdrawal, I began receiving reports that other species throughout their empire were reconsidering their tributary relationships. Worlds that had submitted to Vraktar dominance for generations were beginning to question whether their overlords were as invincible as they had claimed. The humans had done more than win a single battle. They had shattered the myth of Vraktar invincibility that had maintained their empire for centuries. Sir, said Dr. Vixtal as she completed her analysis of human casualties, I need to report something unusual about the wounded personnel. Their recovery rates are exceeding all projected timelines. I accompanied her to the medical facility that had been established to treat the injured humans. What I observed there contradicted standard medical understanding of trauma recovery patterns. Patients with severe injuries were displaying remarkable resilience, not just physically, but psychologically. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had suffered life-threatening wounds during the final assault, was attempting to participate in tactical debriefings from his hospital bed. Private Chun was requesting immediate return to duty despite fractures that would normally require weeks of rehabilitation. Most remarkably, none of the wounded showed signs of the psychological trauma that typically followed intense combat experiences. They're not just recovering from their injuries, Dr. Vixtal explained as we reviewed her medical files. They're displaying enhanced psychological well-being compared to baseline measurements taken before the battle. It's as if participating in this engagement actually improved their mental health. This observation aligned with behavioral patterns I had noticed throughout my time studying human military culture. They seemed to derive psychological strength from facing and overcoming impossible challenges. Rather than being weakened by trauma, they were somehow strengthened by it. Doctor, I asked, what do you make of their attitude toward their fallen comrades? That's perhaps the most unusual aspect of their psychology. Most species show depression and survivor guilt following the loss of unit members. These humans are displaying what I can only describe as elevated pride. They're grieving their losses, but they're also celebrating the manner in which their comrades died. I spent the evening reviewing recordings of conversations among the wounded humans. Their discussions revealed a psychological framework that treated honorable death in combat as a form of achievement rather than tragedy. They spoke of their fallen comrades with pride, sharing stories that emphasized their courage and determination rather than mourning their absence. Captain Williams went out exactly the way she would have wanted, said Corporal Davis, his arm in a regeneration cast from wounds suffered during the final Vraktar assault. She always said she'd rather die fighting than live in a universe where humans back down from bullies. This attitude extended beyond individual cases to encompass their collective understanding of the battle's significance. The humans weren't just satisfied with having survived the Vraktar assault. They were proud to have participated in an event that would be remembered throughout galactic history. On my final day at Zirian Prime, Major Harrison requested a private meeting to discuss my observations and conclusions. We sat in his temporary office, surrounded by reports and equipment salvaged from the destroyed command bunker, while reconstruction teams worked to rebuild the settlement around us. Analyst Zeth Kree, he began formally, I want to make sure you understand the implications of what you witnessed here. This wasn't an isolated incident or an unusual tactical situation. This is who we are. I'm beginning to comprehend that, Major. My preliminary reports to Confederation intelligence have generated significant interest at the highest levels of command. Harrison nodded. Good, because what happened here is going to happen again, and again, and again, every time someone tries to intimidate humanity into submission. We don't surrender, we don't retreat, and we don't negotiate with bullies. He activated his personal communication device and showed me a message that had arrived through encrypted channels from Earth Command. This is from the Human Colonial Administration. They're authorizing the establishment of permanent settlements in 17 sectors that were previously considered too dangerous due to Vraktar proximity. The implications were staggering. Based solely on the psychological victory achieved at Zirian Prime, humanity was expanding into territories that had been effectively controlled by their enemies for generations. Sir, I said carefully, are you certain that humanity is prepared for the consequences of this expansion? The Vraktar Empire will not forget what happened here. Harrison smiled with the same expression I had seen on Colonel Chen's face during our first meeting. Analyst, I think you're still missing the point. We're counting on them remembering what happened here. We want every species in the galaxy to know exactly what they can expect if they decide to threaten human territory or human lives. That evening, I transmitted my final report to Confederation intelligence. It was the longest and most comprehensive analysis I had ever prepared, containing tactical assessments, psychological profiles, and strategic recommendations that would influence galactic policy for decades to come. But the most important section was my personal evaluation of humanity's role in future galactic conflicts. Human military forces represent a paradigm shift in galactic warfare that existing tactical doctrine cannot adequately address. They have weaponized concepts that most species consider weaknesses: willingness to accept casualties, disregard for overwhelming odds, and psychological framework that treats death in combat as preferable to surrender. More significantly, they have demonstrated the ability to achieve strategic objectives through tactical defeats. By making victory against them psychologically unacceptable to their enemies, they have created a form of deterrent effect that superior technology and numbers cannot overcome. Recommendation: any species considering military action against human forces should be prepared for engagement parameters unlike anything in recorded military history. Standard cost-benefit analysis does not apply to opponents who consider honor and principle more valuable than survival. As I prepared to depart Zirian Prime aboard the next available transport, Major Harrison presented me with a gift that I treasure to this day: a small metal medallion bearing the emblem of a human settlement and the date of the battle. Sir, he said as he handed me the medallion, this is to remember what you witnessed here. But More importantly, is to remember what you learned about humanity. I accepted the gift with appropriate gratitude, though I wasn't sure I fully understood its significance at the time. What exactly did I learn, Major? Harrison looked out at the reconstruction work proceeding around us, where human engineers and workers were building their settlement back up from the rubble of war. You learned why the universe fears us, analyst. It's not because we're stronger or smarter or more advanced than anyone else. He turned back to meet my gaze directly. It's because we're the only species that looks at impossible odds and says challenge accepted. As my transport lifted off from Zirian Prime and began its journey back to Confederation space, I realized that my understanding of warfare, psychology, and galactic politics had been fundamentally altered by my time with the humans. I had come to study a military force, and instead had witnessed the emergence of something unprecedented in galactic history. I had witnessed the birth of a legend. The humans at Zirian Prime had done more than defeat a superior enemy force. They had established a reputation that would precede them into every future conflict. From that day forward, any species considering aggression against humanity would have to weigh their objectives against the psychological cost of victory. As we traveled through hyperspace toward the core worlds, I found myself wondering what other impossible things these humans might accomplish. If a small settlement could psychologically defeat the Vraktar Empire, what could humanity achieve when they decided to take the offensive? The universe was about to find out. 6 months after the Battle of Zirian Prime, I found myself standing in the Grand Assembly Chamber of the Galactic Confederation Council, preparing to deliver testimony that would reshape interstellar relations for generations. Representatives from 47 different species filled the massive amphitheater, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of clicks, whistles, harmonics, and electromagnetic pulses as they discussed the implications of my report. The chamber fell silent when Chairman Kveltar called the session to order. As the senior representative of the Altarian Collective, he possessed the kind of gravitas that commanded respect from even the most aggressive species in the Confederation. His 6 eyes focused on me with an intensity that made clear the importance of my testimony. Analyst Zeth Kree, he began, his translation device, converting his native harmonic speech into standard galactic frequencies. Your preliminary reports regarding the incident at Zirian Prime have generated considerable discussion among our member species. Before we proceed with formal policy considerations, the Council requires clarification on several points. I activated my presentation system and began displaying the tactical data I had compiled during my observation mission. Honored representatives, I have prepared a comprehensive analysis of human military capabilities based on direct observation of their forces under extreme combat conditions. The first holographic display showed the force composition and equipment levels of the human settlement. Murmurs of confusion rippled through the assembly as representatives noted the primitive nature of human technology and the impossibly small size of their military force. As you can see, I continued, the human military presence consisted of fewer than 250 personnel equipped with weapons and vehicles that would be considered obsolete by most civilized standards. They possessed no energy shields, no gravity manipulation devices, no quantum communication systems, and no orbital support capabilities. Representative Vorth A.K. of the Crystalline Assembly raised one of his mineral-based appendages. Analyst Zeth Kree, if their technological capabilities were so limited, how did they resist a full Vraktar assault force? Our intelligence estimates suggested that battle group contained over 15,000 veteran warriors equipped with modern weapons. I had anticipated this question, though I still struggled to explain what I had witnessed in terms that other species could comprehend. The humans employed what can only be described as psychological warfare on a scale unprecedented in galactic military history. They weaponized their own willingness to die. The chamber erupted in confused discussions as representatives attempted to process this statement. Chairman Kveltar called for order before addressing me directly. Please elaborate on this concept of weaponizing willingness to die. The Council requires specific examples. I activated the next series of displays, showing recordings from the Canyon engagement and selected portions of the main battle. What followed was 20 minutes of the most disturbing combat footage ever presented to the Galactic Council. Representatives watched human soldiers charge directly into overwhelming enemy fire, continue fighting despite mortal wounds, and display what could only be described as enthusiasm while facing certain death. The reaction was immediate and profound. Several representatives from naturally prey species activated their emergency beacons and requested immediate escort to their ships. The hive mind collective withdrew all their drones from the chamber simultaneously. Most disturbingly, the Vraktar delegation, present to provide their own perspective on the battle, sat in complete silence with what their body language suggested was barely controlled terror. These recordings announced Representative Silthara of the Peaceful World Alliance. Her melodic voice, carrying undertones of horror, demonstrate behavior patterns that violate fundamental principles of evolutionary psychology. No species develops survival instincts that encourage self-destruction in hopeless situations. I had spent months analyzing this exact question. Representative Silthara, that assessment would be correct for any other species we have encountered. However, humans have evolved psychological mechanisms that treat individual survival as secondary to group welfare and abstract principles. What do you mean by abstract principles? Asked Chairman Kveltar. Concepts such as honor, duty, and what they call freedom. Humans appear willing to suffer unlimited casualties in service of these ideas, even when doing so provides no tangible benefit to their survival or reproductive success. The chamber buzzed with discussions as representatives struggled to comprehend military forces motivated by non-material considerations. For species that had evolved rational approaches to resource competition and territorial disputes, human behavior represented something outside their understanding of how intelligent life should function. Representative Vorthake spoke again. Analyst Zethkri, surely there must be limits to this behavior. No species can sustain unlimited casualties without eventual collapse. I activated my final set of displays, showing population and recruitment data that I had obtained through diplomatic channels with Earth Command. According to human government sources, military recruitment increased by 300% following the Battle of Zirion Prime. When news of the engagement reached Earth, volunteers attempted to enlist in numbers that exceeded their military's processing capabilities. The silence that followed this revelation was unlike anything I had experienced during my career with the Confederation Intelligence Division. Representatives who had been discussing policy implications and military strategies suddenly found themselves contemplating something far more fundamental: the emergence of a species that grew stronger through adversity rather than weaker. Chairman Kveltar eventually broke the silence. Are you stating that human casualties at Zirion Prime actually increased their military recruitment rather than decreasing it? That is correct, sir. Furthermore, the humans have established 17 new settlements in sectors previously controlled or contested by the Vraktar Empire. They are actively expanding into territory that other species consider too dangerous for colonization. I noticed the Vraktar delegation exchanging communications that their translation devices did not convert for public consumption. Their obvious distress suggested that my report confirmed intelligence they had already gathered through their own sources. Representatives, I continued, there's another aspect of human psychology that the Council must consider. The events at Zirion Prime have become what humans call a legend. They have incorporated the battle into their cultural mythology in a way that will influence their behavior for generations. Expiten commanded Sherman Koviltar. Humans use stories of heroic sacrifice to inspire future generations. The soldiers who died at Zirion Prime are now considered heroes whose example should be emulated. Rather than serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of military service, their deaths have become a recruitment tool for encouraging similar behavior. Representative Silthara's translation device struggled to convey her emotional state as she responded. You are describing a species that has institutionalized self-destructive behavior and treats it as a virtue. More than that, I replied. They have created a psychological framework that makes their enemies afraid to fight them, even when victory is mathematically certain. At this point, War Commander Thekvor of the Vraktar delegation requested permission to address the council. His massive form dominated the speaker's platform as he began what would become one of the most significant testimonies in galactic political history. Honored representatives, he began, his deep voice carrying undertones that a species used to convey authority. I commanded the assault force that engaged human military units at Zirion Prime. I must confirm the accuracy of analyst Zeth Kree's observations. The chamber fell completely silent. War Commander Thekvor was a legendary figure whose military campaigns had conquered entire star systems. His testimony carried weight that no amount of analytical data could provide. The humans fought with a ferocity that exceeded anything in our combat experience. More significantly, they displayed complete disregard for casualties that should have forced immediate surrender. When we eliminated their defensive positions, they attacked. When we surrounded their forces, they continued advancing. When we inflicted casualties that should have broken their morale, they began singing. The word singing seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence. Representatives throughout the chamber struggled to process the concept of warriors who sang while facing death. War Commander, said Chairman Kveltar carefully, please describe the strategic implications of this engagement for your empire's territorial expansion plans. Thekvor's response will be quoted in military academies throughout the galaxy for centuries afterward. Honored Chairman, the Vraktar Empire has suspended all military operations in sectors adjacent to human space. We have concluded that the psychological cost of victory against human forces exceeds any territorial or resource benefits that such victory might provide. The revelation that the most aggressive military force in the galaxy had voluntarily ceased expansion due to human psychological warfare sent shockwaves throughout the Confederation. Representatives began requesting immediate recesses to consult with their governments about the implications for their own territorial and trade relationships. During the recess, I was approached by Ambassador Terran of the Neutral Worlds Coalition. Her species had evolved on a high-gravity world that produced naturally cautious psychology and extreme risk assessment capabilities. Analyst Zeth Kree, she said quietly, I must ask you a personal question. After witnessing human combat behavior firsthand, what is your professional assessment of their long-term intentions? I had been considering this question for months without reaching a satisfactory conclusion. Ambassador, I believe the humans are fundamentally different from any species we have previously encountered. They do not appear to be motivated by traditional considerations of territorial expansion, resource acquisition, or political dominance. Then what motivates them? The preservation and expansion of what they call human values, concepts related to individual freedom, collective self-determination, and resistance to what they perceive as tyranny or oppression. Ambassador Terran's sensory apparatus indicated deep concern. Are you suggesting that humans might eventually attempt to impose their values on other species? No, Ambassador. Based on my observations, humans appear willing to fight to defend their own values, but show no inclination to force them on others. However, they will respond with unlimited force against any threat to human lives or human territory. When the council session resumed, Chairman Kveltar announced that the Confederation would be establishing new protocols for diplomatic relations with humanity. These protocols acknowledged human space as a sovereign territory with special status that reflected their demonstrated military capabilities. More significantly, the Council voted to establish the Zirian Accords, a formal agreement that recognized humanity's right to use unlimited force in response to attacks on human settlements or civilians. This was the first time in galactic history that the Confederation had granted a member species carte blanche for military retaliation. The final portion of my testimony addressed the question that every representative had been avoiding. What would happen when humanity decided to take offensive action rather than simply defending their territory? Representatives, I said as I concluded my presentation, the humans at Zirian Prime demonstrated that they can psychologically defeat superior forces while defending fixed positions. We have no data on their capabilities when conducting offensive operations with the initiative and tactical advantages that attacking forces typically possess. The implications of this statement were clear to every military strategist in the chamber. If humans could terrify the Vraktar Empire while outnumbered and defending, what could they accomplish when they chose the time, place, and nature of their engagements? War Commander Thekvor provided the answer that everyone feared to hear. The Vraktar Empire has reached a formal conclusion regarding future military operations involving human forces. We will not engage them under any circumstances. The psychological cost of victory has been determined to exceed any possible benefit. As I prepare to leave the council chamber, I reflected on how completely my understanding of galactic politics had changed since that first day at Zirian Prime. I had arrived there expecting to observe the routine military operations of a minor species. Instead, I had witnessed the emergence of humanity as the dominant psychological force in galactic civilization. The universe fears humans not because they cannot be defeated, but because defeating them requires becoming something that no civilized species wants to become. To beat humans in combat, you must be willing to match their disregard for casualties, their enthusiasm for impossible battles, and their complete commitment to principles that transcend individual survival. Most species are not prepared to make those psychological sacrifices, even for victory. 6 years have passed since the Battle of Zirian Prime, and humanity has established over 300 settlements in previously contested territories. No major power has challenged their expansion. The Vraktar Empire has withdrawn from 17 star systems rather than risk additional encounters with human military forces. 3 other aggressive species have modified their territorial ambitions to avoid potential conflicts with humanity. The humans achieved galactic dominance not through superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but by making everyone else afraid to fight them. They have weaponized the one thing that no other species possessed in sufficient quantities: the willingness to pay any price for victory. As I complete this final report from my retirement on the peaceful world of Altair 7, I often find myself wondering what the galaxy will look like in another generation. Humanity continues expanding, but they have honored their commitment to avoid forced annexation or cultural imperialism. They simply establish their settlements, defend them with absolute determination, and wait for their neighbors to decide whether the cost of opposition exceeds the benefits. So far, no one has been willing to pay that cost. The universe still fears humans, and based on everything I witnessed at Zirian Prime, that fear is entirely justified. They have proven that courage, properly applied, can be the most devastating weapon in the galaxy. They charge into battle not because they are guaranteed victory, but because they are guaranteed to make their enemies remember why they should have chosen peace. That is why the universe fears them. That is why the universe will always fear them.